This FedGov Today program is sponsored by Iron Mountain Government Solutions and Carasoft. Welcome back. The Coast Guard has an icebreaker now that's new to its fleet, but it's not a brand new ship. The service bought what's now the Coast Guard cutter Storis on the commercial market while it waits for the construction of a brand new polar security cutter. Abbie Tingstad is Arctic research professor at the Coast Guard Academy. At Sea Air Space, she tells me how the Guard is connecting acquisition programs and the hardware that comes out of them to strategy.
With the polar security cutters, those are a heavier icebreaker. And there's a difference between being able to physically access a region and having a presence, which to me is much more enduring, much more, geographically distributed, kind of being able to be where you need to be and do what you need to do when you need to, right? And right now, the U.S. has plenty of capabilities of accessing the Arctic and Antarctic, but not necessarily the ability to be exactly where you need someone to be, if that makes sense. Yeah. So having greater capacity is going to be really, really important. And I mentioned the Antarctic as well, because actually the Polar Security Cutter program, at least as originally intended, is a little more focused on the Antarctic mission. Not that it wouldn't be useful in the Arctic as well, but I just wanted to highlight that the U.S. has some really important presence needs at both poles. And so when you even think about that, it's almost a multiplied capacity need as well.
So how does one define presence in the Arctic, especially considering Russia's more active there than they ever have been? China has declared itself a near Arctic nation. How is that dynamic changing the way that the United States strategically thinks about what it should be doing there? Right.
Well, it starts actually with just having awareness of what's going on in the region and being able to communicate about it. And I think that really highlights the fact that even though icebreakers are one of the most, visible types of polar presence, they're not the only type of polar presence that, the U.S. and other nations need there. So it really starts with being able to know what's going on, communicating it, and then being able to get to where you need to be, whether that's by icebreaker or it might be by fixed-wing aircraft, it might be by helicopter, it might be by all of the above and something else as well. People are also really important, especially trained personnel to do search and rescue in the Arctic and other things are an important part of the portfolio also. So to me, presence really means having everything that is required to execute a mission. And those missions look different depending on where you are, whether in the Arctic or Antarctic.
So what is the full inventory that we as a nation, not even necessarily just Coast Guard assets, but what should be there in order to have the presence that we as a nation should have vis-a-vis China and Russia, especially now?
Yeah. So, it's really combining all of the capabilities that we have to access the different domains. And I use that term loosely. I know that it has a definition, but we can think about, surface and subsurface, of course, air, land, but also the electromagnetic spectrum, cyber domain, things like this. And so it's really about having the ability to know what's going on in and across all of those domains, and then being able to go and execute whatever effect you need to do in order to shape the activities in those domains in a way that benefits the U.S. national and homeland security.
Another thing that I understand is changing dramatically there is the environment. I spoke to a retired Navy admiral. It's been about 2 years since he and I had this conversation, but he had about 2 years before that been in the Arctic for the first time in about 25 years. And I said, what were the major differences? He said, number one, it was dramatically more accessible than it had ever been before. And number two, he said there was a lot more plastic in the water than he had seen the first time, which he considered important. How is the differing condition, the changing conditions in that part of the world changing the way that we should approach it strategically?
Yeah. So I think understanding that it is changing and that it is changing in different ways at a relatively rapid pace is really important. And one good example of that is that you mentioned increased accessibility. I think it's important to note that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not hazardous to navigate in the Arctic region. And that's one thing that I think sometimes when we read the news, I think we sometimes mistake having less sea ice part of the year for being like, oh, we'll just send up a cruise vessel and it'll be fine, without any additional safeguards and things like that. So one thing that's becoming increasingly important is really understanding how changes in sea ice, changes for those that are concerned with land, physical environments, ice roads and things like that. And also, as you noted, changes in the way that humans are using the Arctic region, whether that be economically or otherwise. You mentioned Russia and China earlier, understanding patterns of Russian behavior in the Arctic, understanding patterns of Chinese behavior in the Arctic, very important, and understanding how those are different as well, and how U.S. Kind of historical partners in the Arctic region are also maybe sharing some of the U.S.'s goals and interests in the Arctic region, but in some ways are also different.
Who are our most important partners strategically there? I would obviously think of Canada first of all. Who else are our most important valuable partners in Arctic strategy?
Yeah, so I would say that fundamentally it's really the Arctic countries themselves. So, and you mentioned Canada, of course. There are so many reasons to think of Canada first and foremost, and I think those continue in terms of where the Arctic is going. The Nordic countries, of course, are important partners as well. Over the summer, the U.S. and Norway, for example, had a space launch together, led by Norwegian Space Agency, of course, but the U.S. was able to put some payloads on that. So that kind of demonstrates another important way that the U.S. has partnered with the Nordic countries historically. And, historically, too, and this is a difficult topic in some ways, but thinking about Russia, how has the U.S. engaged with Russia in the past in the Arctic, and how has that changed? Because in some ways, when it comes to things like co-managing, incidents that may happen in the Bering Strait, in that sense, Russia is that country that the U.S. is communicating with. So it is a bit of a complicated landscape, or seascape, if you will. But I think first and foremost, we have to think of the Arctic in that holistic way, that there are different ways of partnering with different actors in that region.
Considering coming from the posture of China and Russia being potential adversaries, are their interests in the Arctic the same or similar, or is there an opportunity for us to gain some kind of leverage with one versus the other if their interests are separate or if they diverge?
Yeah, I think their interests are very different, actually. And I don't want to discount the potential threat and danger of having Russia and China partnering and sometimes very, very closely with surface vessels going together in the Arctic region. I don't want to discount that at all, but I do want to note that Russia is an Arctic nation with a lot of history in the Arctic, a lot of its own economic interests in the Arctic, whereas China is not an Arctic state. They did declare themselves a near Arctic state some while ago, but I believe that they've actually stopped using that particular term at this point. And then if you actually look at China's level of economic investment in the Arctic region, there is a lot of money in it, perhaps financially, but a lot of that is really within Siberian natural gas projects. And so China has not always been successful in some of its other projects that it's been looking to do. So overall, its economic footprint, if you will, in the Arctic remains very small if you look at it from that perspective. Yes, China does have icebreakers. In terms of other Arctic capabilities, not particularly. And so we might also think about China's strategic interests in the Arctic. Yes, like some other non-Arctic states interested in kind of looking into the region as having a foothold. I think China especially wants to be seen as a nation with Arctic interests and capabilities. But some of the other types of activities that China maybe has done in the Arctic may very well have to do a little bit more about Beijing's displeasure with U.S. policy in other parts of the world, as opposed to what's actually going on in the Arctic. And I think policy that understands that China and Russia are different actors in the Arctic could very well be stronger. Because after all, Russia and China do not have a very positive history together if you look over the course of time. And so perhaps it's convenient for them to be engaging together right now in the Arctic region. But whether that will last into the future, I actually think the U.S. and its Arctic allies could actually have a big role in how that looks in the years to come.
What's the future look like in your view? What are the markers? I know it's impossible to predict the future, but what do the markers look like moving forward in that part of the world in your view?
Yeah. Well, I think this is really a nice opportunity. I guess I'm a glass half full person, but I think it's a nice opportunity really to build on some of the work that the Arctic nations and other stakeholders, including the indigenous groups in the Arctic, have really done right, which is kind of coming together, trying to foresee problems that may happen. And even though there is not necessarily a completely common vision probably for the region, but at least drawing on things that they do have in common and trying to make those happen. Now, I also think that there are many stumbling blocks potentially. There is a lot of different types of changes across all the different, physical environment, economics, security, military. But I also think it's very much within Arctic stakeholders and, hands, to do something about it. So I take a positive view of it.